The American dream, in the autumn of 1975, had a particular look and feel in a place like Willow Creek, Minnesota. It was a life painted in harvest gold and avocado green, a world of wood-paneled station wagons and the muffled, optimistic hum of a Zenith television set filtering through a living room window. It was a place where doors were often left unlocked, where the rustle of leaves in the tall oaks was the most common sound after dusk, and where the deepest-seated fear was an early frost threatening the corn harvest. Willow Creek was a tapestry woven from familiar threads. The Friday night lights of the high school football field, the Sunday morning sermons at the Lutheran church, the gossip exchanged over Formica countertops at the town's only diner. It was a town of just under 3,000 souls, a tight-knit community where everyone knew your name, your business, and your family history. It was precisely the kind of place you'd move to in order to escape the dangers of the wider world, a sanctuary of predictable rhythms and shared values. For the Jacobson family, living in a modest two-story home on Elm Street, Willow Creek was supposed to be that sanctuary. It was here they believed their children could grow up safe, insulated from the anxieties that flickered on the national news each evening. The sprawling, shadowy forests that bordered the town were for adventure, not for dread. The placid, meandering creek that gave the town its name was for skipping stones, not for holding secrets. But on a crisp Friday in late October, the carefully constructed illusion of safety in Willow Creek would be irrevocably shattered. A single, ordinary autumn day would become the dividing line in the town's history, the moment everything changed. The story of the Jacobson children is not just a story of a disappearance. It is the story of a town's loss of innocence, a chilling reminder that the darkest shadows can fall on the most unassuming of places. Tom and Sarah Jacobson had built their life in Willow Creek with deliberate care. Tom, a steady and quiet man of 42, managed the local grain elevator, a position of respect in an agriculturally driven community. He was a man defined by routine, his days measured by the rumble of grain trucks and the scribbled figures in his ledgers. Sarah, 39, was the vibrant heart of the family. She was a homemaker, a role she embraced with a creative flourish. Her days filled with baking, sewing, and tending to the sprawling garden that was her pride and joy. She was a familiar sight at school bake sales and town potlucks. Her warm laugh, a frequent sound in the small circles of Willow Creek society. They were good people, dependable and kind, the sort of family that formed the bedrock of the community. Their 3 children were a reflection of their parents, yet each was distinctly their own person. Mark, at 16, was on the cusp of manhood. Tall and lean, with his father's quiet intensity, he was a solid, if not stellar, student and a dependable player on the high school's junior varsity basketball team. He had a passion for mechanics, spending countless hours in the garage tinkering with his prized possession, a second-hand Schwinn Stingray bicycle he was perpetually modifying and repainting. He was a boy of few words, often seeming to carry a weight beyond his years, a silent observer who noticed more than he let on. Then there was 14-year-old Jenny, a stark contrast to her older brother. Where Mark was reserved, Jenny was effervescent. She was a Stratus student, with a quick wit and a social calendar that was the envy of her friends. Her bedroom was a collage of pop culture, the walls adorned with posters of Sean Cassidy and the Bay City Rollers. Her telephone was a near-permanent fixture, a lifeline to a world of whispered secrets and adolescent dramas. She was navigating the fraught, exciting terrain of her first year of high school, her life a whirlwind of classes, cheerleading practice, and fledgling romances. And finally, there was 8-year-old Danny, the family's bright, boisterous caboose. Danny was a boy made of scraped knees, boundless energy, and an insatiable curiosity about the world. He was a collector of things, rocks, bottle caps, and comic books, his pockets always bulging with some newfound treasure. His hero was Evel Knievel, and he spent his afternoons attempting daring, if wobbly, stunts on his own much smaller bicycle, its handlebars festooned with red, white, and blue streamers. He was the child who still believed in magic, who saw the woods behind his house not as trees and dirt, but as an enchanted kingdom waiting to be explored. Together, they were the Jacobsons, a snapshot of the American family, seemingly perfect, entirely normal. But normality is a fragile veneer, and on Friday, October 24th, 1975, that veneer would be stripped away, revealing a void of unimaginable terror. The day began like any other Friday on Elm Street. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves and the distant promise of winter. Inside the Jacobson house, the morning routine unfolded with practiced precision. At 6:30, the alarm clock on Sarah's bedside table buzzed to life. She moved through the quiet house, her footsteps soft on the linoleum floor of the kitchen. She started the coffee, its percolating gurgle a familiar and comforting sound. Tom was next, coming downstairs dressed in his work clothes, a thermos in his hand ready to be filled. He'd kiss Sarah, grab a piece of toast, and be out the door by 7, his departure as reliable as the sunrise. The children were a more chaotic affair. Jenny was first in the bathroom, her lengthy morning ritual, a source of constant friction with her older brother. The scent of her hairspray, a popular brand called Aquanet, would soon permeate the entire second floor. Mark, roused by his mother's third call, would stumble out of his room, his hair a mess, and grunt a barely audible greeting. He would pour himself a bowl of Cap-N Crunch and read the back of the cereal box with the quiet focus he applied to everything. Danny, as always, was the last to the table, his pajamas on, inside out. His mind already on the day's potential adventures. The breakfast conversation was a predictable mix of reminders and last-minute requests. Sarah reminded Mark about his basketball practice after school. She asked Jenny to be home by 5 to help with dinner. She told Danny to wear his jacket because the temperature was supposed to drop. There were no premonitions, no subtle hints of the darkness that lay in wait. It was just another Friday morning, a flurry of activity before the school bus arrived at the corner at 7:45. Sarah stood on the porch, a coffee mug warming her hands, and watched them go. Mark, walking a few paces ahead, his hands shoved in his pockets. Jenny, chatting animatedly with a friend, her book bag slung over her shoulder. And little Danny, kicking at a pile of leaves, his lunchbox decorated with a picture of the $6 million man banging against his leg. She watched until the big yellow bus swallowed them up and rumbled away down the street. It was the last time she would ever see them. The school day passed without incident. At Willow Creek High, Mark attended his classes, including chemistry, where he sat in the back, and American history, where his teacher later recalled him seeming a bit distracted, his gaze fixed on the window. During lunch, he sat with a few other quiet boys from the basketball team, eating the sandwich his mother had packed. He didn't say much, but that was just Mark. Jenny, meanwhile, navigated the bustling hallways with her usual confidence. She aced a pop quiz in algebra, passed notes with her best friend Brenda in English class, and spent her lunch period planning their outfits for the upcoming Halloween dance. She was vibrant and engaged, a picture of youthful exuberance. At the elementary school across town, Danny spent his day learning about fractions and drawing a picture of a pumpkin patch. During recess, he and his best friend, a boy named Timmy, played on the monkey bars and made plans to go exploring in the woods behind Danny's house after school. The final bell rang at 3 o'clock, releasing a torrent of students into the autumn afternoon. Mark left the high school and headed straight for the gym for basketball practice, which was scheduled to end at 4:30. Jenny, her cheerleading practice canceled, decided to walk downtown with Brenda. Their destination was Miller's Drugstore. It's a classic small-town establishment with a soda fountain and a rack of the latest teen magazines. The girls ordered cherry cokes and spent an hour flipping through the glossy pages of Tiger Beat, giggling over pictures of their favorite stars. At around 4 o'clock, Brenda's mother arrived to pick her up for a dentist appointment. The girls said their goodbyes, promising to talk on the phone later that evening. Jenny told Brenda she was just going to walk home, a familiar journey of about a mile. It was the last time Brenda, or anyone else, would report speaking with her. Danny's afternoon followed a different, but equally familiar path. He got off the school bus at his usual stop at 3:15 and ran into the house, dropping his book bag by the door. He called out for his mom, but Sarah had left a note on the refrigerator. She had gone to the grocery store, the IGA downtown, and would be back shortly. The note ended with a smiley face and a reminder: no cookies before dinner. Danny, as planned, went straight to his friend Timmy's house, just 2 doors down. The two boys, full of post-school energy, immediately headed for their favorite haunt, the dense stretch of woods that began at the edge of the Jacobsons' backyard. They called it the Black Forest, a name borrowed from a fairy tale that made their adventures feel grander and more perilous. They spent the next hour or so engaged in the imaginative play of 8-year-old boys, building a crude fort out of fallen branches and pretending to be spies on a secret mission. Sometime around 4:30, Timmy's mother called him home for dinner. Timmy would later tell police that Danny said he was going to stay for just a little while longer. He wanted to find the perfect walking stick. Timmy waved goodbye and ran home, leaving Danny alone in the deepening shadows of the woods. It was a place Danny knew well, a place he had explored 100 times before. But on this day, the familiar woods would not give him back. The first stirrings of unease began subtly, a quiet note of discord in the symphony of the evening routine. Sarah returned from the grocery store around 4:45, her arms laden with paper bags. She called out a greeting as she came through the back door, expecting to hear the television or the sounds of her children. The house was silent. She put the groceries away, glancing at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was almost 5. Jenny should have been home by now, ready to help set the table. She assumed her daughter had lost track of time, perhaps stopping at another friend's house on her way home from the drugstore. She wasn't worried, not yet. She went upstairs to change out of her town clothes and saw Danny's book bag lying by the front door. He was home from school then. She smiled, figuring he was still outside, lost in one of his make-believe worlds in the backyard. She went to the back window and peered out towards the woods. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The woods were growing dark, the trees merging into a single imposing silhouette. She couldn't see him. A small, cold knot began to form in the pit of her stomach. She stepped onto the back porch and called his name. "Danny, dinner's almost ready." Her voice echoed in the still evening air, but there was no reply. Only the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the rising breeze. At 5:30, Tom's Ford pickup truck rumbled into the driveway. He walked into the house, tired from a long week at the grain elevator, and found Sarah standing by the kitchen phone, her brow furrowed with worry. "Jenny's not back yet," she said, her voice tight, "and I can't find Danny." Tom, ever the pragmatist, tried to soothe her. Jenny was a teenager. She was probably on the phone at a friend's house. Danny was likely just down the street. But as the clock ticked past 6, and then 6:30, Tom's own calm began to fray. Sarah had started calling Jenny's friends. Each call yielded the same answer. Brenda confirmed she had left Jenny at the drugstore hours ago. No one else had seen or heard from her since. The knot in Sarah's stomach was now a cold, hard stone. While she was on the phone, Tom went outside to look for Danny. He walked the perimeter of the yard, calling his son's name. He checked the garage, the shed, the small treehouse they had built together the previous summer. Nothing. He walked down the street to Timmy's house. Timmy's mother answered the door, a look of concern on her face. She confirmed that Danny had been there, that he had gone into the woods, and that Timmy had left him there around 4:30. It had been over 2 hours. Tom thanked her, his voice strained, and walked to the edge of the woods behind his own house. He stood there for a moment, staring into the impenetrable blackness. He called his son's name, his voice louder now, laced with a growing panic. The woods remained silent, offering no answers. Around the same time, a new layer of anxiety was added to the unfolding nightmare. The phone rang, and Sarah snatched it up, her heart leaping with hope. And it wasn't Jenny. It was the mother of one of Mark's basketball teammates. She was calling to ask if Mark could give her son a ride home from practice. Sarah's blood ran cold. "Practice," she repeated, her voice trembling. Practice ended at 4:30. The other mother was confused. She said her son had been waiting at the gym, but Mark never showed up. It called home from the coach's office. He said Mark wasn't at practice. He hadn't been there at all. Now the fear was no longer a quiet, creeping thing. It was a monster, unleashed and roaring in the silent house. Mark had never even made it to the gym. Jenny had vanished somewhere between the downtown drugstore and her front door. And Danny was lost, or worse, in the darkening woods. 3 children, all gone. It was an impossible thought, a scenario so horrific it belonged in a movie, not on Elm Street in Willow Creek, Minnesota. At 7:15, with the last vestiges of daylight completely gone, Tom Jacobson made the call that would forever alter the course of their lives. He picked up the heavy black receiver of the telephone in his kitchen and dialed the number for the Willow Creek Police Department. His hand was shaking so badly he had to dial it twice. When a calm, professional voice answered on the other end, Tom's own voice was a ragged whisper. "My children," he said, the words catching in his throat. "My children are missing." The initial response from the Willow Creek Police Department was small, befitting a town where the most common calls were for stray dogs or minor traffic violations. The force consisted of a chief, 4 full-time officers, and a part-time dispatcher. The officer who arrived at the Jacobson house at 7:30 was a young man named Bill Larson, barely 5 years older than Mark Jacobson himself. He was met at the door by Tom, whose face was a pale, drawn mask of anguish. Sarah was in the living room, sitting ramrod straight on the edge of the sofa. Her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Officer Larson, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation, did his best to follow procedure. He took down the basic information: the children's names, ages, descriptions, what they were last seen wearing. He asked for recent photographs. Sarah, moving like an automaton, retrieved the most recent school pictures from a photo album on the bookshelf. Mark, his expression serious and unsmiling. Jenny, with a bright, hopeful grin. Danny, a toothy, mischievous smile. Looking at the photos, Officer Larson felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. These were not just names on a report, these were the faces of children. He tried to offer reassurance, suggesting they might have gone to a friend's house and forgotten to call, or that they were all together somewhere, unaware of the panic they were causing. But even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow, a flimsy defense against a terrifying and rapidly expanding reality. Within the hour, Police Chief Frank Peterson arrived at the scene. Peterson was a veteran cop in his late 50s, a man who had seen more than his share of human folly and tragedy during a stint with the Minneapolis police force, before he had moved to Willow Creek for a quieter life. He was a large, imposing man with a gruff exterior that concealed a sharp, methodical mind. He listened intently as Officer Larson briefed him, his gaze sweeping over the tidy, homey living room, a space that now felt charged with an almost unbearable tension. Peterson knew immediately that this was no ordinary case of runaway teenagers or a child who had lost track of time. 3 children from the same family, disappearing from 3 different locations, all within the same narrow time frame. The statistical improbability was staggering, suggested a coordinated event, a scenario far more sinister than anyone wanted to consider. He separated Tom and Sarah, speaking with them individually to get their accounts of the day. His questioning was gentle but firm, probing for any detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Had there been any arguments? Any unusual behavior from the children in recent days? Any strangers seen around the neighborhood? Any new people in their lives? Tom and Sarah, their minds reeling from shock and fear, struggled to answer. Their life had been so normal, so predictable. There were no major fights, no dark secrets, no obvious threats. They were a happy family, or so they had believed. As the night deepened, the Jacobson home transformed into an impromptu command center. The kitchen table was littered with coffee cups, notepads, and a crackling police scanner that filled the silence with bursts of static and clipped official voices. The phone rang incessantly, with calls from neighbors offering help, from friends offering prayers, and from the press who had already gotten wind of the story. Peterson organized the initial search efforts. He sent officers to canvass the route Jenny would have walked home from the drugstore, knocking on doors, rousing people from their beds, asking if they had seen a 14-year-old girl in a blue jacket and bell-bottom jeans. He dispatched another team to the high school to check the gym, the locker rooms, any place Mark might have gone. But the most urgent focus was on the woods behind the house. The search for 8-year-old Danny could not wait for daylight. Using powerful, heavy-duty flashlights, a small group of officers, joined by Tom Jacobson and a few neighbors who had heard the news, pushed into the darkness. Their flashlight beams cut sharp, narrow paths through the black, illuminating a chaotic tangle of trees and undergrowth. They called his name over and over, their voices strained and anxious. Danny Jacobson. The only response was the rustle of unseen animals and the sigh of the wind in the branches high above. The woods that had been a playground just hours before now felt vast, menacing, and utterly indifferent. News travels fast in a small town, and by 10 o'clock, The story of the missing Jacobson children had spread like wildfire. Through Willow Creek, the initial whispers of concern had grown into a collective roar of fear and disbelief. This was the kind of thing that happened elsewhere in big cities, on the television news. It didn't happen here. It didn't happen to people you knew. Town's volunteer fire department was activated, its members arriving in pickup trucks to join the search for Danny. A sense of grim purpose settled over the community. Men who normally spent their Friday nights at the local VFW hall or watching television were now trekking through the cold, dark woods, their faces etched with worry. Women from the church auxiliary descended on the Jacobson house, bringing casseroles and coffee, their presence a silent, supportive vigil in the face of the unthinkable. They tidied the kitchen, answered the relentlessly ringing phone, and offered what little comfort they could to Sarah, who seemed to be shrinking into herself, her eyes wide and vacant. The house on Elm Street, once a symbol of quiet domestic happiness, had become the epicenter of a town's shared nightmare. Every ticking second of the clock was an eternity, every gust of wind a potential whisper of a child's voice. The searchers in the woods found nothing. No footprints, no dropped glove, no sign of the little boy with the $6 million man lunchbox. The canvas of Jenny's route home was equally fruitless. No one remembered seeing her after she left the drugstore. The high school was empty and locked, with no trace of Mark. It was as if all three children had simply been erased from the face of the earth. Sometime after midnight, a discovery was made that sent a jolt of both hope and terror through the search party. About a half-mile into the woods, not far from the crude fort Danny and Timmy had been building, a searcher's flashlight beam landed on a small, familiar object lying in a bed of damp leaves. It was a walking stick, freshly whittled at one end, the kind a small boy might make. A few feet away, partially hidden under a log, was a single comic book. It was a copy of The Incredible Hulk. Tom Jacobson's breath caught in his chest when he saw it. It was Danny's. He had bought it for him just last week. The discovery focused the search in that area, a frantic, desperate combing of every bush, every hollow, every shadow. But the hope quickly faded. There were no other signs. No tracks leading away from the spot. No scrap of clothing. No indication of a struggle. It was just the stick and the comic book, lying there in the immense silence of the forest. It was a clue that led nowhere, a breadcrumb that only deepened the mystery. Why would he have left them behind? Had someone met him here? The questions hung in the cold night air, heavy and unanswerable. Chief Peterson, a man trained to look for patterns in logic, found himself adrift in a sea of terrifying possibilities. The random, disconnected nature of the disappearances was baffling. A boy from the woods, a girl from a downtown street, a teenager from a high school parking lot. There was no clear link, no obvious motive. It felt like an act of profound and terrifying randomness, a tear in the fabric of the logical world. As the first pale light of Saturday began to filter through the trees, the searchers emerged from the woods. Their faces streaked with dirt, their bodies aching with exhaustion. The night had yielded nothing but fear and frustration. The official search for Danny was suspended, to be resumed with greater numbers once the sun was fully up. At the Jacobson house, the night had been a long and brutal vigil. Sarah had finally succumbed to an exhausted, tormented sleep, sedated by the family doctor who had been called to the house. Tom sat at the kitchen table, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, staring at the three school pictures that now seemed like relics from another lifetime. Chief Peterson, fueled by black coffee and a growing sense of dread, knew that the investigation was entering a critical phase. The first 24 hours were crucial in any missing person case. Every passing hour dramatically decreased the chances of finding them alive and well. He needed more manpower, more resources than his small department could provide. He made a call to the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the state's top investigative agency. It was a concession of defeat, an admission that the town of Willow Creek was facing a monster it could not fight alone. By mid-morning on Saturday, the town was swarming with outsiders. The BCA had arrived, setting up a command post in the town hall. They brought in professional search and rescue teams with trained dogs, the helicopter to conduct an aerial search of the vast woodlands and farm fields that surrounded Willow Creek. News vans from Minneapolis and St. Paul lined the streets. Their tall antenna is a stark metallic intrusion on the small-town landscape. Reporters, sensing a major story, descended on the community. Their cameras and microphones pointed at anyone who was willing to talk. The disappearance of the Jacobson children was no longer a local tragedy. It was becoming a statewide and soon a national headline. The faces of Mark, Jenny, and Danny were suddenly everywhere, on television screens. On the front pages of newspapers, their school pictures now broadcast to a world far beyond the safe confines of Willow Creek. The townspeople, unaccustomed to such scrutiny, reacted with a mixture of fear and suspicion. They closed ranks, protective of the Jacobsons' privacy, and wary of the outsiders who now walked their streets. The investigation, now under the joint command of Chief Peterson and a stoic EXPERIENCEDBCA agent named David Keller, began to systematically deconstruct the lives of the Jacobson family, searching for any clue, any anomaly that might explain the inexplicable. Detectives re-interviewed everyone who had seen the children on Friday. They spoke again with Brenda, Jenny's best friend, pressing her for every detail of her conversation with Jenny at the soda fountain. They talked to Timmy, Danny's friend, going over his account of their time in the woods, with painstaking care. They interviewed Mark's basketball coach and his teammates, trying to understand why he had never arrived for practice. From these interviews, a clearer, but no more comforting, timeline began to emerge. Mark was last definitively seen leaving the high school at 3 o'clock. He had told a friend he was going to the gym. His bicycle, the Schwinn Stingray he cherished, was missing from the garage. The assumption was that he had ridden it towards the school, but a thorough search of the school grounds and the surrounding area turned up nothing. Jenny was last seen at 4 o'clock, waving goodbye to her friend outside Miller's drugstore. She had a 1-mile walk home, a route she had taken hundreds of times. It was a walk that would have taken her past dozens of houses, through the heart of the town. Yet no one else seemed to have noticed her. Danny was last seen by his friend Timmy at 4:30 on the edge of the woods. He was less than 200 yards from the safety of his own backyard. The window of opportunity for whatever happened to them was alarmingly narrow. And yet, in that small sliver of time, all three had vanished without a trace. Chief Peterson and Agent Keller stood by the yellow police tape, staring at the old red barn. The discovery of the bicycles had changed everything, and yet it had explained nothing. It was another piece of a puzzle that refused to take shape. It connected the three children physically for the first time since they had left for school on Friday morning. But it did so in a way that defied all logic. The barn loomed before them, a silent, decaying witness. It had been checked in the initial search, but only cursorily. Now, it was the most important location in the entire investigation. It had to hold an answer. Keller gave the order for his team to make a careful, systematic entry into the barn. The massive wooden doors groaned in protest as two agents forced them open, revealing a vast, dark interior, thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and ancient hay. Shafts of light from cracks in the walls pierced the gloom, illuminating swirling dust motes and the ghostly shapes of old, rusted farm equipment. The team moved inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They started on the ground floor, a large open space littered with debris. They checked the empty animal stalls, the old milking parlor, the tack room. Nothing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the dirt floor and the cooing of pigeons nesting in the high rafters. They moved to the hayloft, climbing a rickety wooden ladder with caution. The loft was even darker, the air hotter and more stagnant. It was filled with rotting bales of hay, stacked in precarious piles. The agents began the slow, unpleasant work of moving the bales, checking every corner, every shadow. The work was exhausting, the hay scratching at their skin, the dust clogging their throats. Peterson and Keller waited outside, the tension mounting with every passing minute. They had to find something. A piece of clothing, a footprint, a sign of a struggle, anything to tell them what had happened here. After nearly an hour of searching the loft, one of the agents called down. His voice was tense. "You'd better get up here." Peterson and Keller exchanged a look of grim anticipation and climbed the ladder into the stifling darkness of the hayloft. The agent was standing in the far corner, his flashlight beam trained on the floor. He had moved aside a half-dozen bales of hay, revealing a section of the wooden floor that was bare, except for a scattering of loose straw. In the center of the illuminated circle, Something was carved into the dusty wood of the floorboards. It wasn't a name or a date or a random doodle. It was a single, crudely etched word. A word that had no place on a farm, in a barn, in the middle of Minnesota. A word that sent a chilling new current of fear through the heart of the investigation. Peterson leaned in closer, his own flashlight beam joining the other. His breath catching in his throat as he read the word aloud, his voice a low, disbelieving whisper. Run. The discovery of the word carved into the floor of the hayloft was a profound and deeply unsettling turning point. It was the first direct communication, the first intentional message found since the children had disappeared. But it was a message shrouded in terrifying ambiguity. Who had carved it? Was it a warning from one of the children? A desperate plea left for someone to find? Or was it something more sinister? A taunt left by their abductor? A cruel and twisted piece of psychological warfare? The forensics team carefully photographed the carving and attempted to lift any possible prints from the surrounding area. But the rough, dusty surface of the old wood yielded nothing of value. There was no way to know when it had been made, or by whom. The discovery only deepened the chasm of unanswered questions. If one of the children had carved it, it implied they had been here, in this barn, for some length of time, suggested they were not immediately harmed. But it also suggested they were in the presence of a danger so great that their only thought was of escape. The word was not help. It was run. A word of primal fear, an instruction for survival. The search of the rest of the Miller farm intensified. Every square inch of the property was examined with renewed urgency. The decrepit farmhouse was breached, its boarded-up windows torn away. Investigators moved through the decaying rooms, their flashlights cutting through years of dust and neglect. They found evidence of transients and teenage partiers, old beer cans, discarded cigarette packs, graffiti on the walls. But they found nothing that could be definitively linked to the Jacobson children. The house was a dead end. They searched the other outbuildings, the crumbling silo, the collapsed chicken coop. They even drained the old, murky well near the farmhouse. A grim and laborious task that yielded nothing but rusted buckets and slick black mud. The farm had given up the bicycles and the single, terrifying word, but it seemed determined to hold on to the rest of its secrets. The focal point of the investigation had now shifted from 3 separate disappearance sites to this one, isolated, sinister location. The children had been here. That much seemed certain. But what happened next was a complete and utter mystery. Where did they go from the barn? Did they run, as the message implored? And if so, in which direction? And who, or what, were they running from? Agent Keller, a man accustomed to the cold logic of evidence, found himself increasingly unnerved by the psychological landscape of the case. The bizarre combination of clues felt almost theatrical, the scattered personal items in the woods. The 3 bicycles neatly placed, but not hidden. The cryptic message in the hayloft. It didn't fit the typical pattern of a stranger abduction or a crime of opportunity. It felt planned, deliberate, almost like a game. This thought was deeply disturbing. Suggested an offender who was not just violent but intelligent, patient, and cruel. Someone who was enjoying the terror they had unleashed. Someone who was watching and waiting. This feeling was amplified by a series of strange and unsettling phone calls that began to come into the police station. They were brief, silent calls. The dispatcher would answer, and there would be nothing but open air on the other end of the line. No voice. No sound, just an unnerving stillness that would last for 10 or 15 seconds before the caller hung up. At first, they were dismissed as cruel pranks, an unfortunate but common occurrence in high-profile cases. But the calls kept coming, 2 or 3 a day, always from different payphones in towns and cities across the state. It's making them impossible to trace in an era before caller ID. Keller began to wonder if these silent calls were connected, if they were the offender's way of staying involved. Of monitoring the investigation, a silent taunt to the police, who were so desperately searching for him. While the investigators wrestled with these new, unsettling developments, Tom and Sarah Jacobson remained trapped in their own private hell. The discovery of the bicycles had been a cruel blow. For a brief, agonizing moment, it had brought a surge of hope. Their children's things had been found. They were close, but that hope had quickly evaporated, replaced by an even deeper dread. The barn, the word, the implications of it all. The knowledge that their children had been at that desolate place was almost too much to bear. Sarah rarely left the house now. She would sit in the living room for hours, staring out the window, her body racked with tremors. She would wander into the children's empty bedrooms, touching their things, a baseball glove, a stuffed animal, a hairbrush, as if trying to conjure them back into existence through sheer force of will. Tom tried to remain strong, to be the steady rock for his wife, but the strain was beginning to break him. He spent his days at the command post, a silent, ghostly presence, watching the maps on the wall, listening to the crackle of the police radios, waiting for a piece of news that never came. The community, which had rallied so strongly at first, was now in a state of suspended animation. The large-scale volunteer searches had been called off. The professionals had taken over. The townspeople were left to watch, and to wait, and to fear. Parents held their children closer. The streets of Willow Creek, once so safe and familiar, now felt menacing. Every passing car, every unfamiliar face, was a potential threat. The town's innocence had been murdered, and in its place was a cold, pervasive anxiety. Days turned into a week, and the investigation, despite the flurry of activity at the Miller farm, had once again stalled. The lead of the dark-colored sedan had gone nowhere. Dozens of similar cars had been checked and cleared. The farmer, Hank Larson, was unable to identify any of them from photographs. The silent phone calls continued, a constant, unnerving background noise to the case, but they offered no tangible clues. The search of the vast wilderness surrounding the Miller farm was a fruitless and exhausting effort. The area was a patchwork of dense forests, swampy lowlands, and abandoned quarries filled with dark, cold water. It was a landscape that could hide a secret forever. Divers were sent into the quarries, their lights penetrating the black water, but they found nothing. Helicopters saw nothing but an endless canopy of trees. The Jacobson children, and the person or people who took them, had vanished from the Miller farm as completely as they had vanished from their own lives a week earlier. Agent Keller and Chief Peterson were running out of options. They had thrown every available resource at the case. They had a crime scene. They had physical evidence. They had a potential witness to a suspicious vehicle. And yet, they were no closer to finding the children than they had been on the first night. The case was a baffling collection of contradictions, a puzzle with too many pieces missing. It was on a cold, gray Thursday, nearly 2 weeks after the disappearance, that a new witness came forward. Her name was Agnes Peterson, no relation to the chief, an elderly woman who lived in a small, isolated house on a gravel road about 5 miles from the old Miller farm. She was a recluse, a widow who rarely left her home, and was known in the area for being somewhat eccentric. She didn't own a television, and only read the newspaper sporadically. It was auntie until a neighbor brought her some groceries and told her the full story of the missing children, that she realized the significance of something she had seen. She contacted the police, and Chief Peterson, though skeptical, drove out to her small, cluttered house himself. Agnes, a frail woman with sharp, clear eyes, told him that on the Friday, the children disappeared. Sometime in the late afternoon, she had been looking out her kitchen window. Her house overlooked a large, empty field, and beyond that, the woods. She saw something that day that was out of the ordinary. A man, walking out of the woods and across the field. He was a tall man, she said, wearing a dark jacket and a hat. He was walking quickly, with a purpose. But that wasn't the strangest part. Following behind him, about 20 paces back, were 3 children. A tall boy, a girl, and a smaller boy. They were walking in a single file line, their heads down. They were not talking or playing. They were just walking, following the man. Agnes said she watched them for a few minutes until they crossed the field and disappeared onto another dirt road. She said she thought it was strange, the way they were walking, so quiet and subdued. It looked like a father taking his children for a walk, but it didn't feel like it. There was no joy in it. There was something wrong. Peterson's heart pounded as he listened to her story. The description of the children was a perfect match for Mark, Jenny, and Danny. The location was miles from where any of them were last seen, but it was in the general direction one might travel from the Miller farm. He pressed her for more details about the man. She said she couldn't see his face clearly, he was too far away. But she remembered one more thing. As the man and the children disappeared from her view, She noticed something about the little boy at the back of the line. He had stumbled for a moment, and as he did, something fell from his hand. He didn't stop to pick it up. He just kept walking, his head down. Agnes hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, with the knowledge of who those children were, the memory had come rushing back. Peterson asked her if she could show him where she had seen them. The old woman put on her coat and led the police chief out into the field behind her house. She walked with a steady, determined gait, her eyes scanning the ground. After a few minutes of searching the spot where she remembered the boy stumbling, she stopped and pointed. There, half buried in the damp soil and flattened grass, was a small, grimy object. Peterson knelt down, his breath misting in the cold air. Using a handkerchief, he carefully picked it up and wiped away the dirt. It was a small metal tin, rusted at the edges. On its faded, scratched lid was a picture of a rocket ship. It was a child's Band-Aid box. He opened it. Inside, nestled in the remaining cotton, were not Band-Aids, but a collection of small, ordinary things. A smooth gray stone, a bottle cap from a bottle of Coca-Cola, a single, tarnished brass key, and a small, folded piece of paper. Peterson's hands trembled slightly as he carefully unfolded the brittle, creased note. On it, written in the clumsy, blocky print of a young child, were 2 words. 2 words that would once again turn the investigation on its head and open up a new, terrifying chapter in the search for the Jacobson children. The note read, "Not him." The 2 words, scrawled in the unsteady hand of a child, changed the molecular structure of the investigation. Not him. The phrase echoed in the cold autumn air with a terrifying resonance. It was not a plea for help, nor a cry of pain. It was a clarification, a piece of information delivered from an unknowable void. In the passenger seat of his police cruiser, racing back towards the command post in Town Hall, Chief Frank Peterson held the small tin box in a handkerchief on his lap as if it were a live grenade. The brass key, the smooth stone, the bottle cap, these were the sacred artifacts of an 8-year-old boy's world. They were intimate and heartbreakingly normal, but the note transformed them, suggested that Danny, in the midst of his own terror, had possessed the presence of mind to communicate, to leave a clue that was both incredibly specific and maddeningly vague. Not him? Not who? The immediate logical assumption was that him referred to the tall man in the dark jacket, whom Agnes Peterson had seen leading the children across the field. If that were the case, the note was a profound enigma. Was Danny saying that the man Agnes saw was not their captor, but perhaps a rescuer? Or was he trying to signal that this man was not the primary threat, that there was someone else involved, someone more dangerous? The possibilities spiraled outward, each one darker than the last. At the command post, the discovery was met with a grim, electric excitement. It was the first tangible piece of evidence that felt like it had been deliberately left by one of the children. BCA agent David Keller, a man who dealt in facts and evidence chains, stared at the tiny, folded piece of paper under the harsh fluorescent lights of the town hall basement. He saw not just a clue, but a psychological portrait of their abductor. This was not a simple crime of opportunity. The methodical disappearances, the placement of the bicycles, the cryptic word in the barn, and now this note. It all painted a picture of an offender who was controlled, intelligent, and relishing the chaos he had created. He was allowing the children a sliver of hope, a chance to leave these small tokens, perhaps as part of a twisted psychological game. The note "not him" could be a genuine message from Danny, or it could be a piece of misdirection, dictated by the captor himself to send the police chasing shadows. The ambiguity was the point. It was an act of terror designed to cripple the investigation with uncertainty. Keller's first order was to have the note and the tin box flown immediately to the BCA forensics lab in St. Paul. Every resource would be brought to bear on these small objects. They would search for fingerprints, for hair, for fibers, for any microscopic trace that could give them a lead. In 1975, this was a painstaking analog process, a world away from the instant results of modern forensics. It would take time, and time was the one thing they did not have. The interview with Agnes Peterson was conducted again, this time by Agent Keller himself. He walked with her through the story, minute by minute, detail by detail. She was a surprisingly sharp witness, her memories vivid and clear. She described the man's gait, the way he walked with long, confident strides. She described the children, their posture slumped in what she interpreted as wariness or sadness. She could not, however, offer any more detail on the man's face. The distance had been too great, the hat obscuring his features. Based on her testimony, a composite sketch was commissioned. It was a difficult task, creating a face from a memory of a faceless man. The result was a generic but haunting image. A man with sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and dark eyes shadowed by the brim of a hat. The sketch was released to the public, plastered on telephone poles and in post office lobbies across the state. It appeared on the evening news in Minneapolis, the handsome, unsmiling face staring out from thousands of television screens. The man in the sketch became an instant phantom, a nameless boogeyman who haunted the collective imagination of the state. He was the face of the crime, the him that Danny's note may or may not have been referring to. The public now had a villain to search for, and the tips began to pour into the police station by the hundreds. The town of Willow Creek, which had been holding its breath for 2 weeks, now found itself at the center of a national media storm. The story of the 3 missing children from a small idyllic town, combined with the bizarre clues of the abandoned bicycles and the cryptic notes, was irresistible to the national press. Journalists from New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles descended upon the town, their rental cars crowding the streets, their cameras transforming the quiet grief of the community into a public spectacle. The Jacobson house on Elm Street was under permanent siege. Tom and Sarah became prisoners in their own home. The simple act of checking the mail, an ordeal of flashing camera bulbs and shouted questions. They watched their own tragedy unfold on the national news, their family pictures displayed alongside the eerie sketch of the phantom abductor. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in America, spoke their children's names on the CBS Evening News, his solemn tone lending a terrible weight and finality to their disappearance. The story was no longer theirs. It belonged to the world now, a horrifying piece of American folklore in the making. This intense scrutiny began to fracture the fragile sense of unity that had initially defined the town's response. The reporters, hungry for new angles, began to dig into the town's secrets. They interviewed anyone who would talk, and in a small town, there were always people willing to talk. Old grievances, forgotten rumors, and petty jealousies were dredged up and presented as potential motives. The whispers that had once been confined to hushed conversations in the diner were now being hinted at on national television. The focus inevitably returned to Tom and Sarah. In the court of public opinion, grieving parents were often the first suspects. News reports began to subtly question the narrative. Why had Tom Jacobson waited until after 7:00 AT to call the police? Why did Sarah Jacobson seem so composed in the few brief clips the cameras managed to capture of her? The public, desperate for a simple explanation for an incomprehensible crime, began to latch onto these questions. Letters started arriving at the police station, some offering prayers and support, but others filled with vile accusations condemning the Jacobsons and claiming the entire affair was an elaborate and monstrous hoax. For Tom and Sarah, it was an unimaginable cruelty, a public stoning that occurred while they were still reeling from the loss of their children. Inside the investigation, the new leads were being pursued with relentless energy. The flood of tips about the man in the sketch was overwhelming. Every man in a 5-state area who bore even a passing resemblance to the drawing was reported to the authorities. Investigators spent countless hours chasing down these leads, most of which were born of paranoia and mistaken identity. But a few tips stood out. One name that came up repeatedly was that of Arthur Finch. Finch was a local man in his early 40s, reclusive figure who lived in a small, rundown cabin on the outskirts of the county. He was a Vietnam veteran who had come home from the war a changed man, quiet, solitary, and prone to long, aimless walks in the woods. He fit the general physical description of the man in the sketch, and he had a reputation in town for being strange. He kept to himself, worked odd jobs, and was known to be a bit of a loner. To the frightened townspeople, his eccentricity now looked like guilt. The police began a quiet surveillance of Arthur Finch. They watched his cabin from a distance, documenting his comings and goings. They interviewed his employer at the lumberyard where he occasionally worked. They spoke to the few people who knew him. The picture that emerged was of a sad, lonely man, not a monster. But in a case this cold, suspicion was a wide net. While one team of investigators focused on Finch, another pursued a different, equally plausible theory, one rooted in the ambiguity of Danny's note, not him. What if Danny was not referring to the stranger, but to his own father? What if the children had been taken by someone they knew and Danny, overhearing the adults talk about his father being a suspect, had tried to clear his name? This theory, as painful as it was, had to be explored. It forced investigators to look again at the family's inner circle. They compiled a list of every relative, every friend, every associate of the Jacobson family. On that list was a name that immediately drew their attention: Rick Snyder. Snyder was a man in his late 30s who had worked at the grain elevator under Tom Jacobson. He had been fired about 6 months prior for drinking on the job. The termination had been acrimonious. Snyder had made threats, vowing to get even with Tom for ruining his life. He was known to have a temper, and he had a history of petty crimes. He also lived just a few towns over. A team of detectives was dispatched to interview him. Snyder was hostile and uncooperative. He had a shaky alibi for the afternoon of the disappearances, claiming he was at a bar, but no one could definitively remember seeing him there. He denied having anything to do with it, but his anger and his obvious hatred for Tom Jacobson made him a compelling person of interest. The investigation now had two strong, but completely different, suspects: Arthur Finch, the reclusive stranger, and Rick Snyder, the disgruntled employee with a motive for revenge. The forensics report from the BCA lab in St. Paul came back, and it was a crushing disappointment. The technology of the era was simply not up to the task. The small Band-Aid tin had been wiped clean, or handled in such a way as to leave no usable fingerprints. The same was true of the contents. The note itself was the biggest letdown. The paper was a common type, torn from a standard notebook. The ink was from a popular brand of ballpoint pen. There were no prints, no identifying marks. The lab had been unable to recover a single hair or fiber from the tin or its contents. It was another dead end, a testament to the frustrating limitations of 1970s forensic science. The offender was either incredibly lucky or incredibly careful. Agent Keller suspected the latter. The lack of physical evidence was itself a form of evidence, pointing to a level of forensic awareness that was rare in common criminals. This strengthened his private theory that they were not dealing with a local loner or a disgruntled employee, but with a far more sophisticated and experienced predator, someone who had possibly done this before and knew exactly how to avoid leaving a trace. He ordered a nationwide teletype, sending the details of the Jacobson case to every major police department in the country, asking them to check their files for any similar unsolved disappearances. It was a long shot, a search for a pattern in the vast chaos of American crime. As October bled into a cold and dreary November, the hope that had sustained the community began to die. The vibrant colors of autumn had faded, replaced by the stark gray landscape of impending winter. The search for the Jacobson children, though officially still active, had lost its momentum. The national media, their narrative, exhausted, packed up their cameras and moved on to the next tragedy, leaving Willow Creek to grapple with its new, silent reality. The town was caught in a state of suspended grief. There could be no closure, no memorial, no moving on. The children were simply gone, their fate an open wound in the heart of the community. The yellow ribbons that had been tied around the old oak trees, once a symbol of hope, now looked faded and forlorn, a constant painful reminder of the loss. The investigation was also mired in frustration. The surveillance of Arthur Finch had yielded nothing. He followed his quiet, predictable routine, showing no signs of guilt or agitation. Investigators who watched him began to believe they were wasting their time. They were persecuting a man whose only crime was being different. The investigation into Rick Snyder was similarly stalled. He had hired a lawyer and was refusing to speak further with the police. Without any physical evidence linking him to the crime, they had no grounds to arrest him. He remained a free man, living under a dark cloud of suspicion, his name whispered in the grocery store aisles and over backyard fences. For Tom and Sarah Jacobson, life had become a waking nightmare. The initial shock had given way to a dull, persistent agony that never subsided. They moved through their empty, silent house like ghosts, surrounded by the echoes of their children's laughter. Every small thing was a torment. A smudge on the wall at a child's height, a pair of sneakers left by the back door, a half-finished drawing on the kitchen table. Sarah, convinced the police were failing, sought out other avenues for hope. She contacted a well-known psychic from California, a woman who claimed to have helped law enforcement solve dozens of cases. The psychic, after being sent photographs of the children and maps of the area, provided a series of dramatic, but ultimately useless, visions. She spoke of water, of a white building with a red roof, of the number 7. The police, obligated to follow up on every possibility, spent days searching reservoirs and checking buildings that matched the description, all to no avail. It was a cruel and expensive diversion that only deepened Sarah's despair. Tom, on the other hand, retreated into himself. He took a leave of absence from his job at the grain elevator, unable to face the sympathetic but pitying looks of his coworkers. He spent his days in his study, surrounded by maps and police reports. He became an amateur detective, rereading every witness statement, retracing every timeline, searching for the one missed detail, the one tiny inconsistency that would break the case open. His obsession was a way of channeling his grief, of imposing order on a chaotic and meaningless universe. But it also drove a wedge between him and Sarah. They were two people adrift in the same ocean of pain, but they were in separate boats, unable to reach each other. As the first snows of winter began to fall, dusting the bare trees and frozen fields in a blanket of white, the investigation seemed to be entering a state of permanent hibernation. The command post in the town hall was quietly downsized. Agent Keller and the BCA team, while still officially assigned to the case, were being pulled into other, more recent crimes. Chief Peterson was left to manage the slow, trickling flow of information, the occasional false sighting, the endless dead ends. The case file, now several thick binders full of reports, interviews, and photographs, was a testament to a massive and fruitless effort. It seemed destined to join the sad, dusty ranks of unsolved cases, a permanent stain on the history of the town. The people of Willow Creek began to reluctantly accept that they might never know what happened to Mark, Jenny, and Danny Jacobson. The story began to transition from a news event into a local legend, a cautionary tale told to children to keep them from wandering too far from home. The phantom in the sketch, the word in the barn, the note in the field. These became the elements of a terrifying bedtime story, their true meaning lost to time. It was during this period of quiet resignation, just before Thanksgiving, that the case took another sharp, unexpected turn. The lead came from the most unlikely of sources, a routine inventory check at a bus station baggage claim in Omaha, Nebraska, nearly 400 miles from Willow Creek. A clerk, clearing out unclaimed items that had been left for more than 30 days, came across a small tan-colored suitcase. Standard procedure was to open the luggage to check for identification. Inside, amidst a few items of cheap generic clothing, the clerk found a high school yearbook. It was from Willow Creek High School for the previous academic year. The clerk, vaguely remembering the national news story about the missing children from Minnesota a month earlier, felt a chill run down his spine. He immediately called the local police. The Omaha police, in turn, contacted the BCA agent Keller. His interest in the case instantly reignited, flew to Omaha the next morning. In a sterile police evidence room, he examined the contents of the suitcase. The yearbook was the most significant item. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the rows of student photographs, and there she was. In the section for the freshman class was the smiling, hopeful face of Jenny Jacobson. The discovery of the yearbook was a bombshell, but it was what Keller found next that truly electrified the investigation. Tucked inside the pages of the yearbook was a small, folded piece of paper. It was a receipt from a diner in a small town in western Iowa. The receipt was dated Saturday, October 25th, the day after the children disappeared. It was for a simple meal, a hamburger, French fries, and a Coca-Cola. At the bottom of the receipt, a waitress had scribbled a phone number. Keller immediately had the number traced. It belonged to a payphone at a truck stop on Interstate 80, about 50 miles from where the diner was located. This was a stunning development. It suggested that Jenny, or someone in possession of her yearbook, had been traveling south, away from Willow Creek, in the days immediately following the disappearance. It was the first piece of evidence that placed one of the children far outside the initial search area, But it also raised a host of new, bewildering questions. Was Jenny a runaway? Had she planned this? It seemed utterly out of character. And if she had run away, where were Mark and Danny? Did this mean their disappearances were separate and unconnected events? Was she with her captor who was transporting her across the country? The suitcase contained no other identifying items, no clothing that could be traced to Jenny. The few items it did contain were for an adult male, cheap and well-worn. Keller and a team of agents immediately drove to the small Iowa town where the diner was located. The town was a dusty, forgotten stop on an old state highway, a place most people passed through without a second glance. The diner was a small, greasy spoon with cracked vinyl booths and a faded sign. Keller showed the waitress on duty, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, a picture of Jenny. The waitress didn't recognize her. He then showed her the picture of the man from the composite sketch. She hesitated, then shook her head. But when he showed her a photograph of Rick Snyder, the disgruntled former employee, her eyes widened in recognition. She said she remembered him. He had been in the diner that Saturday. He was alone, she said, and he seemed agitated, constantly looking out the window towards the parking lot. She remembered him because he had tried to shortchange her on the bill. She didn't remember him with a teenage girl. She did remember him using the payphone. This was the break they had been waiting for. It was the first piece of evidence that potentially linked one of their primary suspects to a location where one of the children might have been. The theory was now clear and terrifying. Rick Snyder had abducted the children, perhaps killed Mark and Danny, and was now on the run with Jenny. Based on this new evidence, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Rick Snyder on suspicion of kidnapping. But when the police tactical team descended on his small rental house, they found it empty. The house had been cleared out. The neighbors said he had packed up his car and left in a hurry a few days earlier, shortly after his last interview with the police. A manhunt was launched. Snyder's name and photograph were broadcast across the nation. He was now officially a fugitive, the prime suspect in the disappearance of the Jacobson children. The news revitalized the case, creating a new wave of media attention. The narrative was now simple and clear. A vengeful, dangerous man had stolen 3 children, and he was on the run. The focus of the entire country was now on finding Rick Snyder. The faces of the other suspects, like the reclusive Arthur Finch, faded into the background. The phantom in the sketch was replaced by the real, sneering face of a known fugitive. For Tom and Sarah Jacobson, the news brought a fresh wave of agony. The idea that their children were in the hands of a man who hated them, a man who wanted revenge, was a uniquely personal and terrifying form of torture. Their hope for a safe return dwindled to almost nothing, replaced by the grim expectation of a violent and tragic end. For weeks, the manhunt for Rick Snyder consumed the resources of law enforcement agencies across the Midwest. Sightings were reported from a dozen different states, from truck stops in Illinois to motels in Colorado. Each tip was meticulously followed up, but Snyder seemed to have vanished. He was a ghost, always one step ahead of the police. The investigation in Willow Creek continued, but it was now focused on building a case against Snyder in his absence. Detectives re-interviewed everyone who knew him, searching for any information about where he might go, who he might contact. They searched his abandoned house with a fine-tooth comb. They found little of interest, just the sad remnants of a lonely, angry life. But in the back of a closet, tucked away in an old shoebox, they found a collection of photographs. Most were old family pictures, but one stood out. It was a Polaroid, slightly faded, of Rick Snyder standing in front of a car. He was smiling, his arm around a woman who was not his ex-wife. The car was an older model sedan, dark green, with a large dent in the rear bumper. It was a perfect match for the car the farmer, Hank Larson, had seen on the logging road on the day the children disappeared. This was the smoking gun. The car linked Snyder directly to the woods behind the Jacobson house at the precise time Danny went missing. The case against him now seemed overwhelming. The motive, the sighting in the diner, the suspicious car, it all pointed to his guilt. The national media declared the case all but solved. All that remained was to find Snyder, and they hoped to find Jenny Jacobson alive. The town of Willow Creek breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster had a name and a face, and he was not one of them. He was an outsider, a man with a grudge. The fear that had gripped the community began to recede, replaced by a grim desire for justice. The focus on Tom and Sarah Jacobson lifted, their status as victims restored in the public eye. There was a sense, for the first time in months, that the end was in sight. But Agent Keller was not convinced. The case against Snyder was almost too perfect, the pieces fitting together with a neatness that felt suspicious. There were still too many unanswered questions. If Snyder had taken all 3 children, why was there evidence of only Jenny traveling with him? Where were Mark and Danny? If his motive was revenge against Tom, why had he not made a ransom demand or contacted the family to taunt them? And what about the note? At him. If Snyder was the man Agnes Peterson saw, then Danny's note seemed to exonerate him. It didn't make sense. Keller's unease was dismissed by his superiors as professional caution. The evidence was strong, the narrative was compelling, and the political pressure to close the case was immense. The manhunt for Rick Snyder was the only priority. The manhunt ended abruptly, not with a dramatic shootout or a tense standoff, but with a quiet discovery in a different jurisdiction. In early December, a park ranger in the forested mountains of western Arkansas, over 800 miles from Willow Creek, was on a routine patrol when he noticed a car that had been driven off a remote access road and into a deep ravine. It was a dark green sedan with Minnesota plates and a dented rear bumper. Inside the vehicle, the ranger found the body of a man. It was Rick Snyder. He had died from a single, self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The local coroner estimated he'd been dead for at least 2 weeks. In the car with him, police found a handgun, a few belongings, and a hastily scrawled note on a crumpled piece of paper. The note was short and direct. It read, "I'm sorry. I couldn't live with what I did." It was a confession. Rick Snyder, the prime suspect, the monster who had haunted a town and a nation, was dead. The news of Snyder's suicide was met with a complex mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that the man believed to be responsible was no longer a threat. Disappointment that he would never face justice, that he would never have to answer for his crimes. For Tom and Sarah Jacobson, the news was the final devastating blow. Snyder's confession seemed to confirm their worst fears. Their children were gone forever, murdered by this man as an act of petty revenge. The last flickering ember of hope was extinguished. The town of Willow Creek prepared to finally mourn its lost children. The mystery seemingly solved, the case closed. The media reported the story as a tragic but conclusive end to the long ordeal. The case of the missing Jacobson children was over. But for Agent Keller, the suicide of Rick Snyder was not an end, but another frustrating and deeply unsettling chapter in a story that refused to make sense. The confession note was too simple. What I did. What exactly had he done? Kidnapped 3 children? Murdered them? So, where were the bodies? A massive search of the area surrounding Snyder's car in the Arkansas woods was launched, but it turned up nothing. There was no sign that the children had ever been there, and there was still the matter of Jenny's yearbook, found in a suitcase in Omaha. Snyder's car had been found in Arkansas. The geography of the case was a chaotic mess and didn't track. And Keller could not get the image of the other suspect, the reclusive Arthur Finch, out of his mind. Finch had been cleared, but something about him still troubled the agent. On a hunch, born of pure investigative instinct, Keller decided to take one last look at Finch. He requested a detailed background check, deeper than the one they had done initially. He wanted to know everything about the man, where he had lived, where he had worked. Every detail of his life before he came to Willow Creek. It was a procedural formality. A final tying up of a loose end in a case that was, for all intents and purposes, closed. A week later, a thick file arrived on Keller's desk from the FBI's Records Division in Washington, D.C. It was Arthur Finch's military service record from his time in Vietnam. Keller began to read through the dry official documents, the commendations, the transfers, the medical reports. A detail buried deep in a psychological evaluation conducted after Finch was wounded in combat. The report noted that Finch suffered from severe post-traumatic stress and had developed a dissociative disorder. To cope with the trauma, he had created an alternate personality, a kind of imaginary friend or protector. The report even included the name Finch had given to this other self, a name he would sometimes use when talking to himself. Keller's blood ran cold. He felt a sickening feeling of dread and recognition wash over him. He read the name again, his mind reeling as the disparate, nonsensical pieces of the case suddenly, and with horrifying clarity, began to snap into place. He picked up the phone and called Chief Peterson. His voice was grim, his words clipped. He said, "Frank, we have a problem. You arrested the wrong man." It's the name of Arthur Finch's alternate personality. The name buried in that forgotten military file was Mark. The name hit Agent David Keller with the force of a physical blow. Mark, it was a detail so personal, so specific, it could not be a coincidence. The sterile world of investigation, where Keller sought patterns and chaos, this was a pattern of terrifying intimacy. The entire case, with its baffling contradictions and maddening lack of cohesion, suddenly pivoted on this single, decade-old piece of information. The phantom in the sketch, the silent man from the woods, had a name for his own shadow, and that name was Mark. The suicide of Rick Snyder had not been the end of the story. It had been a carefully constructed final act of a play written by a different author entirely. Keller's call to Chief Peterson was not just an update, it was a reversal of reality. Everything they thought they knew was wrong. They'd been chasing a ghost, while the real monster had been living quietly among them, his pathology hidden in plain sight. The investigation into the disappearance of the Jacobson children, pronounced dead and unofficially closed, was violently reborn. The first challenge was a procedural nightmare, Rick Snyder had confessed, in his own desperate hand. He was dead. The eyes of the law and the public, the case was solved. Keller and Peterson now had to build a new case against a man who had been questioned and dismissed. A man who was, for all intents and purposes, cleared. Their evidence was thin, almost esoteric. A 10-year-old psychological evaluation from a military file, theory based on a name. It was not the kind of probable cause that easily convinced a judge to sign a search warrant. Keller spent a sleepless night compiling a new affidavit, his argument resting not on physical evidence, but on a narrative of psychological manipulation. He argued that the crime's bizarre signature, the scattered clues, the theatrical placement of the bicycles, the framing of Snyder, was not indicative of a crime of passion or revenge, but of a profound and organized psychosis. He argued that Arthur Finch was a predator of a different kind, one who did not kill for anger or greed, but to satisfy a fractured and desperate internal logic. It was a long shot, but in the early morning hours, a weary county judge, convinced by Keller's impassioned and detailed reasoning, signed the warrant. The search of Arthur Finch's remote cabin was authorized. As dawn broke over Willow Creek, a convoy of state and local police vehicles moved silently through the sleeping town. Heading for the wooded backroads where Finch lived, the element of surprise was critical. They did not know what they would find. Finch, the quiet loner, the harmless eccentric, was now viewed as a man of immense cunning and potential violence. The tactical team, clad in heavy vests, surrounded the small, dilapidated cabin. Through a pair of binoculars, Peterson watched the front door, his stomach a knot of dread and anticipation. There was no movement, no sign of life. The order was given, and the team breached the door with a single, sharp crack that shattered the morning stillness. They swept through the small, cramped space, their shouts of police, search warrant. Echoing in the cold air, the cabin was empty. Arthur Finch was gone. The interior of the cabin was a portrait of its owner's fractured mind. On one level, it was obsessively neat. The few dishes were clean and stacked, the single bed was tightly made. The worn books were arranged alphabetically on a small shelf, but there were other, more disturbing elements. On a small wooden table, detailed maps of Willow Creek and the surrounding county were spread out. Routes were marked in red ink. Timetables were scribbled in the margins, noting the school bus schedules, the shift changes at the police station, the operating hours of downtown businesses. It was the meticulous planning of a military campaign. In the corner of the room, on the floor, was a large hand-drawn sketch. It was a rendering of the Jacobson family, copied from a photograph that had been printed in the newspaper. But in the drawing, Tom and Sarah's faces had been completely blacked out with a heavy marker, leaving only the three children. It was a chilling depiction of Finch's goal: to erase the parents and possess the children. The search of the small cabin did not take long. There was no obvious sign of the children, no clothing, no blood, no evidence of a struggle. For a moment, a sickening wave of doubt washed over Chief Peterson. Had they been wrong again? Had Finch simply been another sad, lonely man with a strange obsession? Then, one of the BCA agents, tapping on the walls, noticed a hollow sound behind a large cast-iron wood stove. I and another agent pushed the heavy stove aside, revealing a section of the wall where the wooden planks looked newer, the nails less rusted. They pried the planks away, uncovering a dark, narrow opening. A wave of cold, musty air flowed out from the darkness. It was a hidden crawl space, a secret compartment carved out of the foundation of the cabin. An agent shone his flashlight into the blackness. The beam landed on a small metal lunchbox, its surface decorated with the familiar image of the $6 million man. The crawl space was not a prison. It was a shrine. It was a cold, earthen vault where Arthur Finch had curated the artifacts of his crime. It was here the investigators found the missing pieces of the children's lives. Mark's blue and gold Willow Creek high basketball jersey, folded neatly. One of Jenny's white cheerleading sneakers, clean and sitting upright as if ready to be worn, and Danny's lunchbox. Inside the lunchbox were not a sandwich and an apple, but a collection of items that made the seasoned officers recoil. There was a lock of long blonde hair, tied with a piece of yarn. There was a small leather-bound diary, its cover embossed with the name Jenny, and there was a cassette tape recorder, a portable Panasonic model popular in the mid-70s, with a single cassette tape inside. But the most important discovery, the item that would finally unlock the full, horrifying truth of what had happened, was a thick, spiral-bound notebook. On its cover, in neat, blocky letters, was a single word: Mark. It was Arthur Finch's journal. Agent Keller and Chief Peterson sat in the sterile environment of the town hall basement. The journal open on the table between them. They read for hours, the story unfolding in Finch's cramped, precise handwriting. It was not the ranting of a madman, but a cold, detached narrative of his actions, a confession written from the perspective of his dominant personality. The journal explained everything, a Rosetta Stone for an unspeakable crime. Finch's obsession had begun months earlier. He had seen Mark Jacobson playing basketball in the park. The boy's name, the same as his own secret self, was a sign, a cosmic validation of his internal world. He began to watch Mark, following him, learning his routines. He saw in Mark a version of himself that had never been damaged, a life that had not been shattered by the horrors of war. He did not want to harm Mark. He wanted to save him, to preserve him, to absorb his life into his own. He decided he had to take him away from a world that would inevitably corrupt him. But he knew Mark had siblings, a sister, and a younger brother. In Finch's twisted logic, he couldn't just save one part of the family. To truly protect Mark, he had to take them all. He had to create a new, pure family, with himself as the silent, benevolent father. The journal laid out the events of October 24th with chilling clarity. It was a plan executed with military precision. He waited for Mark after school, knowing the boy's passion for his bicycle. He approached him not as a threat, but as a fellow enthusiast, claiming to have a rare vintage part for his Schwinn Stingray at an old abandoned farm he knew. Mark, intrigued and unsuspecting, agreed to follow him. Finch led him to the desolate Miller farm. In the isolation of the old barn, the trap was sprung. He overpowered the teenager, binding his hands with a rope he had brought. He then explained to the terrified boy that his family was in danger, that he was protecting them, and that they would all be together soon. He left Mark tied up in the hayloft and set the second phase of his plan in motion. He rode Mark's bicycle into town, a deliberate act to create confusion. But he knew from his surveillance that Jenny would be at the drugstore. He waited until she was alone and approached her, his face a mask of concern. He told her that Mark had crashed his bike out at the old Miller farm, that he was hurt, and that she needed to come right away. Jenny's fear for her brother overrode any caution. She went with him willingly, getting into his car, the dark green sedan he had borrowed for the day. He drove her to the barn and reunited her with her brother, two pieces of his new family now collected. The final piece was Danny. This was the most audacious part of the plan. He drove back to the woods behind the Jacobson house, a place he knew Danny often played. He found the 8-year-old alone, just as Timmy had said. He approached him with a smile, telling him that Mark and Jenny were planning a surprise for him, a game at a secret fort. Danny, excited by the prospect of an adventure with his older siblings, went with him without a moment's hesitation. Back at the barn, the 3 Jacobson children were finally reunited, prisoners of a man whose motives they could not possibly comprehend. It was then that Mark, in a desperate act of defiance, used a nail he found on the floor to carve the word "run" into the floorboards. A silent scream for his younger siblings to flee, but there was nowhere to run. Finch loaded all 3 children into his car and drove away, leaving the bicycles leaning against the barn. A deliberate and taunting clue for the police he knew would come looking. This is where the story took the turn that Agnes Peterson had witnessed. Finch's journal described driving aimlessly for a time, the children silent with terror in the back seat. He eventually stopped on a remote road, forcing them out of the car for a walk, an attempt to normalize an insane situation. This was the moment the children saw a chance. Spurred by Mark's earlier warning, Jenny grabbed Danny's hand, and they made a break for it, running across the open field. Finch, enraged by this defiance, gave chase. Mark, his spirit momentarily broken, was forced to walk behind them. This was the scene Agnes saw. The tall man, the 2 fleeing children, and the older boy following in defeat. Finch caught them, of course. His strength was no match for theirs. It was during this desperate, futile escape that Danny stumbled and dropped his small tin box, the note inside it a testament to his final, heartbreaking attempt to communicate the truth. Not him. He was not trying to exonerate their captor. He was looking at his older brother, Mark, being forced to walk with the man. And he was trying to tell the world that his brother was not a willing participant. He was a victim too. The note was an act of love, a defense of his brother's honor in the face of unimaginable terror. The journal went on to detail the calculated framing of Rick Snyder. Finch was not just mad. He was brilliant in his madness. He knew from the town gossip about Snyder's grudge against Tom Jacobson. Snyder was the perfect scapegoat. Finch had discreetly stolen Snyder's car for a few hours on the day of the abduction, leaving it covered in mud and deliberately driving it down the logging road where he knew he might be seen. He then returned the car to Snyder's house before the man even realized it was gone. The next part of the plan was even more audacious. After recapturing the children, Finch drove south. He was now in possession of Jenny's school bag, which contained her yearbook. He drove to Iowa, stopped at the diner, and then went to the truck stop and made a call. Leaving the receipt with the payphone number tucked in the yearbook, he then continued to Omaha, where he bought a cheap suitcase. Put the yearbook and some old clothes inside and checked it at the bus station, knowing it would eventually be found. He had created a perfect, false trail, a breadcrumb path that led directly to Snyder and away from himself. His final move was the most cruel. From a payphone, he made one last call, this one not to the police, but to a bar where he knew Snyder drank. He anonymously told the bartender to give Snyder a message, that the police had found evidence linking him to the Jacobson children, and that it was over. That final anonymous tip, combined with the police closing in, was enough to push the unstable Snyder over the edge. His vague suicide note was the confession of a man who had been psychologically broken, convinced by a phantom enemy that his life was over. He died never knowing he was a pawn in a far more twisted game. The last pages of the journal were the most difficult to read. They described where Finch had taken the children after his journey south. He had returned to Minnesota, to a place he had discovered during his long, solitary walks in the woods. It was a place not on any map, a relic of an old mining operation from the turn of the century, a deep stone-lined ventilation shaft hidden in a remote section of the vast state forest miles from any town. The journal ended with a single chilling entry, dated the day after he returned. The family is safe now. They are quiet, can be together forever. Mark understands. The last page was blank. Armed with this final, terrible piece of knowledge, a massive search team was mobilized to the area described in the journal. Agent Keller and Chief Peterson led the way, a grim procession into the heart of the winter forest. After hours of searching the dense, snow-covered woods, they found it. A circular stone structure, nearly swallowed by overgrown brush, its opening covered by a heavy, rusted iron grate. The air around it was still and unnaturally cold. The team used heavy cutting tools to slice through the grate, peeling it back to reveal a black, vertical abyss. A single officer was lowered on a rope into the shaft, his flashlight beam cutting a lonely path into the darkness. The silence that followed was absolute. When the radio on the surface finally crackled to life, the officer's voice was choked with emotion. He had found them. The long, agonizing search for Mark, Jenny, and Danny Jacobson was over. The capture of Arthur Finch was strangely anticlimactic. He was found 2 days later, wandering in a daze on a highway nearly 100 miles away. He had discarded his car and was on foot, his pockets empty, his eyes vacant. When the state troopers stopped him, he offered no resistance. He did not speak. He had completely retreated into the silent fortress of his mind, leaving the world to deal with the wreckage he had created. He was taken into custody, the quiet end to a saga of unbearable violence. The man who had meticulously planned and executed one of the most horrific crimes in the state's history was now a hollow shell. His own identity lost to the shadows he had so long cultivated. The aftermath in Willow Creek was a period of profound and shattered silence. The funerals of the 3 Jacobson children were held on a bitterly cold day in December. The entire town attended, filling the small Lutheran church to overflowing, standing in the snow-covered cemetery as 3 small caskets were lowered into the frozen ground. The shared grief was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The truth of what had happened was almost harder to accept than the not knowing. The monster had not been a drifter or a man seeking revenge. He had been one of them, a quiet neighbor, a familiar face. This knowledge poisoned the sense of community, replacing trust with a lingering suspicion and fear. The simple act of a friendly wave to a neighbor was now freighted with a new, terrible awareness of the secrets people could keep. Willow Creek would never again be the town where people left their doors unlocked. The illusion of safety had been permanently destroyed. For Tom and Sarah Jacobson, the discovery of their children's bodies was the beginning of a different kind of pain. The frantic, desperate hope that had sustained them, however painful, was gone. It was replaced by the cold, heavy certainty of loss. The world that had been frozen in time since October 24th now moved forward, but it was a world they no longer recognized. Tom packed away his maps and his charts, his obsessive investigation now meaningless. He returned to work at the grain elevator, moving through his days like a ghost, his quiet nature now a profound and impenetrable sadness. Sarah no longer sat by the window. She took down the yellow ribbons from the oak tree in the front yard. She packed away her children's belongings, the school pictures, the toys, the clothes, sealing them in boxes as if to contain the unbearable memories. They rarely spoke of what had happened. There were no words that could touch the depth of their shared sorrow. They were 2 people bound together by a tragedy so immense it had hollowed them out from the inside, leaving them to live out their days in the quiet, empty house on Elm Street. For the investigators, the resolution of the case brought no sense of victory. Agent David Keller, though he had found the truth, was haunted by the outcome. He had solved the puzzle, but he had not saved the children. The case became a defining moment in his career, a permanent reminder of the limits of law enforcement and the complex, often unknowable nature of human evil. He would forever be tormented by the question of whether he could have seen the truth about Finch sooner. Whether there was a clue he missed, a connection he failed to make in time. Chief Peterson retired a year later, the Jacobson case having taken a toll from which he never fully recovered. The comfortable, predictable life he had sought in Willow Creek had been a mirage, and the horror he had witnessed had stripped away his faith in the simple goodness of small-town life. He had done his duty, but the faces of the 3 children would follow him for the rest of his days. Arthur Finch was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial, was committed to a maximum security state psychiatric hospital, where he would live out the remainder of his life in a world of silence, never again to speak of the family he had created and destroyed. His silence was a final, frustrating denial of justice for the family and the community he had torn apart. Years passed. The town of Willow Creek healed, as communities do, but the scar remained, inked. The story of the Jacobson children became a permanent part of the town's identity, a dark chapter in its history that was never forgotten. The old Miller farm was eventually torn down, the land plowed over, but no one ever built there again. It remained an empty field, a place the locals subconsciously avoided. The house on Elm Street was eventually sold after Tom and Sarah Jacobson moved away, unable to bear the weight of the memories any longer. New families came and went, their own children's laughter filling the rooms. But for those who remembered, the house would always be the Jacobson house, a silent monument to an unimaginable loss. The American dream, the one painted in harvest gold and avocado green, had once seemed so real in Willow Creek, but now they knew that it was just a fragile veneer, and that sometimes, for no reason at all, the quietest street in the most ordinary town can become the setting for the darkest of nightmares. A place where the rustle of the autumn leaves can sound forever like a whispered, sorrowful goodbye.